Jose Oberle was an initial cadre aggressor whose timing was perfect. He was almost at the end of a tour flying the diminutive A4 Skyhawk with the Navy's VF-121 Adversary Training Squadron when he had been hired by Boothby. The Navy, seemingly always one step ahead of the Air Force in the fighter tactics arena, flew its A4s to simulate the MiG-17, and Oberle had spent 2 years on exchange with them. While responsible for teaching students how to fly the big F4, Oberle had also taken on a role within the Navy's Adversary Air Program, which taught DACT to fleet pilots and Top Gun students. Now ready to return to the Air Force, he interviewed with the Tactical Fighter Weapons Center Vice Commander, Colonel Martinez.
As we sat down, I was giving him my background, and he says, "What are you here for?" And I said, "I want an assignment to Nellis." He said, after he heard what I'd been doing and flying dissimilar for 2 years, he said, "We're starting a new program called the Aggressors, and you'll be perfect for it." So I got back in my T-28, went back to Miramar, and 2 weeks later I had orders to go to Nellis, follow an assignment to the Aggressor program. So it was just getting stood up at the time. Boots Boothby was the squadron commander, Randy O'Neill was the ops officer.
And as quickly as that, he was hired. He was soon involved in hiring new pilots into the unit.
For a while we had hand-picked assignments. We went out and flew around the tactical air forces with all of the wings, and we saw somebody that was really extraordinary. We could go back to tactical assignments and ask for that person by name and pretty much got him unless there was some other reason against that, like he had a remote pending that he couldn't get out of or something like that.
But so-called by-name requests created resentment among the tactical air forces and led some commanders to prohibit their pilots from leaving to join the Aggressors. In fact, Roger G. Wells, one of the architects of the program, had himself been refused permission to leave the F-4 Fighter Weapons School for this very reason. He had put his hands up in disgust and requested an immediate transfer out of the weapons school. But for some coming from outside Tactical Air Command, the route into this new unit was less likely to raise eyebrows. One such initial cadre pilot was Captain Earl Obi Henderson. Henderson had earned the legendary 100 Missions North patch following a tour in the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief over North Vietnam from August 1967 to March 1968. He had been decorated with no fewer than 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses and a Silver Star in the process. Originally an Air Defense Command interceptor pilot, he had been assigned to TAC and the F-105 for his Vietnam tour, before being released back to ADC on his return. Like Oberle, he had seen MiGs up close and personal over North Vietnam and knew what they could do.
We lost a lot of people to high-speed hit and run. Remember, keep it simple. The North Vietnamese during my era were very effective and successful, especially against the Air Force on our deep strikes. We were coming in at medium altitude, fully loaded with bombs, in a formation to counter the SAMs, a very cumbersome pod formation, essentially stacked, from high to low. Very close together, not a good lookout formation. You spend a lot of time flying formation. So very susceptible to air attack. And they would come in a MiG-21 through the Mach doing 1.5, 1.8, 15,000 feet. Come in, pick the target, hose off an ATOL, and just blow right on through. And a lot of that, lost a lot of friends shot down and captured or killed just like that. So saw several of those kinds of attacks, not ever hit. I got involved in a rescue operation north of Haiphong, where my leader had been shot down by a SAM, and I was circling, talking to the rescue people when 2 MiG-21s jumped me, firing at me from, I was very slow, I was very young. Very inexperienced, but I was at medium altitude, not that fast. So involved with talking to rescue people, I didn't notice the airplanes. They made a high-speed pass at me, firing their cannons, and then I spiraled downward to evade them. When I pulled out of the dive, I could see the 2 MiGs, and so I pulled in behind them because they were trying to egress, and they turned to the south and eventually to the west over Haiphong. And so I chased him that whole way, trying to catch him. I had no air-to-air missile. All I had was a cannon. And I got within about half a mile of him or so, and I decided that I was going to at least try to shoot him. So I pulled, Kentucky Windage lead and essentially emptied the cannon from way out of range.
Right.
And was critically low on fuel. I was lucky I didn't lose the airplane. Made it back to the tanker and came back to fight another day.
On return from Southeast Asia, ADC had sent Henderson back to the F-106 Delta Dart, a supersonic interceptor. Within a year, he had applied to and been accepted by the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base in California. But as luck would have it, he was simultaneously offered a slot at ADC's Interceptor Weapons School at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. And since the weapons school was offering him a chance to complete the program and then stay on as an instructor, he made the decision to go to Florida. It was a decision that would shape the rest of his career, and by the time his 3-year tour at Tyndall was up, he had accumulated 1,500 hours in the F-106, most of which were flying dissimilar air combat training.
I was fortunate. You got to think of the era here. When the Aggressors were formed and TAC was not doing anything dissimilar. They were not flying against other people. A big deal. The Navy was, and Air Defense Command was. The U.S. Air Force F-106s were flying dissimilar. Right. And so that's, to be candid, that's why I got into the squadron, because I had 2 years worth of 3 years worth of air-to-air dissimilar air combat in the F-106. Where the TAC people, they certainly flew air-to-air, and the weapons school taught it, and they had good pilots, but they never flew against anything other than another F-4, F-4. To the point, one of the key things, and it was all interplayed in my life, Randy Cunningham, now in disfavor, of course, but way back before he was a congressman, he was a pilot in the Navy, of course, and an ace, and he gave testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee about training and discussed the Navy Top Gun School and their dissimilar training, and he put a plug in for Air Defense Command's program called College Dart, which was an air-to-air red flag back in the early 70s. It was 12 rides, not 10 rides, where people would come in and spend 2 weeks flying nothing but dissimilar. They'd mainly our adversaries were the Navy, because the Air Force TAC people couldn't come in and do that. So out of that testimony, the weapons school TAC was ordered to go look at the Air Defense Command's program. And so they sent their top guys out of the weapons school, F-4 guys, down there to Tyndall to sort of fly in our program and observe and figure out, is it worthy of recognition or adoption or whatever. During that 2-week period that they were there, they briefed, the last weekend they were there, they briefed a lot of different programs going on within TAC. And one of them was they'd just gotten approval to form up the Aggressor Squadron. Right. And that got my attention. It was like, oh, that's what I want to do. And so that set the wheels in motion, and from July to October, November is when I, politicked and called, and it became an easy solution in the long run. Not that I wasn't the best choice in the whole world, but they're having difficulty finding the pick of the litter from all these squadrons around the world, and the wing commanders are complaining. You're taking my best people. You're taking my weapons school, this and that, and they were a very select group of people, very good friends to this day, all the original Aggressors, and I was an easy pick because I wasn't going to hurt TAC. ADC went, oh, wait a minute, but ADC didn't get a vote, and so it made it easy for the personnel people to move me out there.
In the winter of 1972, Boothby's short tenure in charge of the Aggressors came to an end. While the Air Force tried to send him to be the director of operations of a C-130 squadron in Taiwan, He handed over control of the Red Baron project to Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Pappy Frick. Turning down promotion to full colonel, Boothby retired and saw out his years as a public speaker and MC on the Las Vegas Strip. Frick, known as Pappy because he was old for his rank, was another pilot who'd flown the Air Force's MiGs. He was instrumental in the success of a number of Nellis-based programs, black and white, that would follow, including the now famous Red Eagles. Frick began his career in 1954 as an enlisted engine maintainer, but by 1957 he had been awarded his commission and earned his pilot wings, making him an old second lieutenant. He had gone on to fly the F-4 during 3 combat tours in Southeast Asia. Gathering intelligence. Although the Navy's adversary squadron at Miramar had been the first to provide a dedicated opponent for DACT, the Air Force's Aggressor unit was to be far more involved and sophisticated. Oberle reflected that the Aggressors would gain unprecedented access to intelligence about the enemy, his tactics, and his aircraft. The Defense Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, and Air Force Intelligence Agency were all compartmentalized. They were fighting for budget in the intelligence world. As a result, they ran parallel collection and analysis efforts. They didn't put their intelligence to any joint use, and they didn't share. The new Aggressors were able to visit each silo of intelligence and use it to form a complete picture whose sum was greater than its parts. Getting data from the Air Force's Intelligence Agency about its own foreign military exploitation, or FME, was also a challenge, but O'Neill and Frick were ideally placed to facilitate the effort, since both had black contacts in the classified worlds of the Foreign Technology Division and Air Force Systems Command. Those carefully fostered relationships would ultimately pay dividends. The threat at the time was the Soviet Union and the satellites of the Soviet Union that purchased Russian equipment for the use of their air forces. Of the man, the Aggressors wanted to know how he became a Soviet pilot, what path did he take, how did he go through his training from youth and grow up into their PVO Strani, which was the equivalent of their Air Defense Command. In-depth briefings on the MiG-17 and the MiG-21 followed, systems, avionics, capabilities, fuel fractions for how much time they could stay and engage, and so on. No detail was overlooked. For Mike Scotty Scott, a second-generation Aggressor, about more whom later, this was an enlightening aspect of the program for sure.
I can honestly tell you that when I was an F4 driver, I never thought about it. So when I got into the Aggressor program and started learning about their training stuff, I was surprised at how different it was from ours because, you only know what you know. And I just always assumed that, hey, that's the way we train in our Air Force. That's the way they're training in their Air Force, but different philosophies. I thought they were probably just like us. I just found out that they aren't. And different motivations for being in the Air Force, their Air Forces, different retention motivations, just different ways of training, different ways of flying airplanes, different airplanes. You had to fly them different because they were different. Different reasons for their defense capabilities. We never had a war on our property or on our land, on our continent. They had wars on their continent, so they had to learn how to use their airplanes or develop airplanes for a little bit different protection because they were still vulnerable to having more wars on their territory. Truthfully, as a lieutenant, I never thought about any of that stuff. I didn't think about any of it until I got into the Aggressor program. And you know what? In retrospect, maybe that's the way our pilots all thought back in the 60s, and because we hadn't been trained any different. And that was the big value of the Aggressor program, in that it opened our eyes to a different way of doing things.
GCI. With pilot recruitment and intelligence gathering underway, a third dimension was added to the Aggressor experience: the Russians' complete reliance on ground control intercept for their missions. GCI controllers were hired from across the Air Force and tasked to go and understand how Russian formations were directed and employed by Russian ground control intercept areas. Like the Aggressor pilots, the Aggressor controllers were trained to think, act and respond like their counterparts in the Soviet Union. Ahead of the controllers being hired, Henderson had flown to West Germany and visited Wiesbaden Air Base, home to American intelligence in Germany. Here he collected information that had been gathered by an electronic listening post, Tempelhof Air Station, West Berlin, that monitored Soviet fighter communications and observed their maneuvers on radar. While there, Henderson had talked to American GCI controllers tasked with monitoring the East German pilots. He had asked them, "Do you see airplanes coming up?" "Yes, of course, that's our job. We sit and watch them," they told him. "Okay," said Henderson. "Do they separate? One goes to one corner while another goes to another area about 30 miles apart, and then do they fly towards each other?" "Yeah, they do that often." Next he asked them, "When they come together, what happens?" They explained, "The two radar blips merge and flare up as one blip for a second," to which Henderson responded, "Do you count 1001, 1002, 1003, and then all of a sudden they come apart again going in opposite directions? Or do they stay in this one little area for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, where they're kind of all together?" The controllers asked Earl why he cared. "We've never looked at that aspect. Why is that important?" Henderson explained, "Here's the difference. If they come in and they merge together for only 3 or 4 seconds and then they separate, then they're just flying intercepts and they're flying through to the other end. But if they stop and stay in that one area, then they're doing a dynamic air-to-air engagement. That shows where the focus of their training is, and that's the kind of data we need you to provide us with, so we can assess how much of this air-to-air training they're doing versus how much intercept training." Henderson would return to Wiesbaden in the summer of 1973 to interview an East German MiG pilot who had defected to the West. Clark, Alconbury, and another Nellis Aggressor squadron. By the time they had 3 years' worth of operations under their belts, the 64th Fighter Weapons Squadron was considered hugely successful. They were so well received that TAC ordered a second squadron to be stood up at Nellis in 1975. The 65th Fighter Weapons Squadron was born. This squadron, according to Oberle, came about because the TAF's demand for aggressor time outstripped the aggressor's ability to supply. This was partly because the 64th was simultaneously flying as adversary air during Red Flag, the 2-week war game that was intended to get aircrew to the point that they could survive the first 10 missions of a real war. There were not enough bodies or airframes to cover both the roadshow activity and take part in Red Flag. The aggressors were soon to expand to other continents too. After Wells had transferred from the F4 Fighter Weapons School in protest against his commander's decision not to release him to the aggressors, he had moved to the Tifwek. There he contemplated the possibility of an aggressor squadron for the Air Force's Pacific Air Forces Command, or PACAF. He then took an assignment to Clark Air Base in the Philippines and began briefing his idea around PACAF. They liked it, and on August 31st, 1975, the 26th Tactical Fighter Training Squadron was formed, flying T-38s. The name was later changed in 1983 to the 26th Aggressor Squadron. Between 1975 and 1977, Wells served as the squadron's first ops officer. Henderson made major early and was promoted to ops officer at the 64th. Then, in April 1976, he was assigned to the Philippines as the T-38 Standardization and Evaluation Check Pilot for the 13th Air Force. That same month, the 527th Tactical Fighter Training Squadron, equipped with F-5E Tiger IIs, was stood up at RAF Alconbury, England, as the United States Air Force in Europe's resident aggressor unit. While at Clark, Henderson was pivotal in the creation of Cope Thunder, PACAF's version of Red Flag. One of the first recruits to the new aggressor squadron at Clark was Mike Scott. Scott had gone through pilot training in 1971, flown F-4Es in the air-to-air role at Seymour Johnson for his first assignment, and then been sent on a remote tour to Clark for his second assignment. He was flying F-4s of the 90th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Clark when Wells arrived in the Philippines to sell the aggressor concept to PACAF and to recruit pilots for the outfit's initial cadre.
This guy named Roger G. Wells came up and was giving tactics briefings. He used to come once a week and would give a tactics briefing. And he was the one that was starting that air-to-air mentality. He was on I don't know if he was on a remote tour or if he was on a year tour over there, but he was assigned to 13th Air Force, which was co-located. And then when I'd been there less than a month, and the rumors started that they were going to start an aggressor squadron. And so I asked my commander, how do you get to be part of that? Well, coincidentally, Roger G. was asking all the squadrons if they had anybody that would like to volunteer to do that job. And so I raised my hand. Lieutenants weren't in the aggressors in those days. And he called me up for an interview. There was only one other, Animal Larson. Don Larson was in our squadron. He had just come over from George, and he knew what the aggressors were, so he raised his hand. But everybody else said, no, why would you want to go back? And the aggressor airplane at the time was going to be T-38s. Why would you want to go back and fly a T-38 when you can be flying the premier fighter in the Air Force, the F-4s? It was a mission thing for me. Plus, I really admired the guys that did it.
Scott became one of the youngest recruits into the Aggressors, and by September was back at Nellis being put through the second formal Aggressor training course with the new 65th FWS. Two standout parts of the process were learning the secret Aggressor briefings and learning how to debrief without bruising the pilot's ego.
Of course, they taught you how to fly and employ the airplane, but more than that, they taught you how to be an aggressor mentally and how to teach air-to-air flying, how to brief air-to-air flying, how to debrief air-to-air and capture the learning points and the points, both the good and the bad ones, and how to tactfully deliver it's easy to tell somebody they're doing a great job. It's not that easy always to tell somebody that, hey, you need a lot of work, and do it in a way that it doesn't turn them off, and that they want to, that they accept it and move in, especially fighter pilots. I mean, especially young fighter pilots, 20-year-old, 20s-something pilots still have a lot of tests, male pilots, which is all there was at the time, fighter pilot-wise. A lot of testosterone. They don't like to hear when they're doing bad. There's your collar comes up and you get a little bit defensive. So you have to be able to gently and artfully point things out and realize that, okay, some guys aren't going to take it, but then be able to not get argumentative on yourself. What we had to do is not only learn the briefing, but learn the stuff behind the briefing. So when we get asked questions about it, we weren't just remotely doing the weatherman thing, reading off some script. We actually had an understanding about what was going on. So we had to delve into some of the books and some of the documents from which those briefings were created, so we could have that background to be a good briefer instructor. Mine, I said, was the man. I learned the man. I brought that back, and then my job also, I had to get a briefing, copies of the slides made, and have them all packed up. It was a secret briefing, maybe even a top secret briefing, and then get it organized so it could be shipped back to Clark, because we didn't have that stuff. And then when it showed up at Clark, of course, then I was in charge to get that one put together. And then we all the other briefings were done the same way. And then when we got back to Clark, even though we had learned how to do it and had to kind of go through at Nellis, our briefing before we left, we came back and Roger G wouldn't let us go on the road. He was our operations officer. He said, before you go on your road, you're going to have to pass briefing by me and by the rest of the squadron. So we had verification or validation sessions in front of the squadron where we had to give our briefing. And I think it took me 3 days. And I also gave another one was the aircraft was one of my briefings. By the time I left the Aggressors, I was qualified in all of them, because you needed a sub once in a while when the guy that was supposed to do it got sick or couldn't make the trip or whatever it was going to be. But the one, I guess my first validation one was not the man. As I think back about it, it was the airplanes, because I remember talking about the MiG-17, talking about the MiG-21 and the MiG-23, and when the briefing was all over, Roger, gee, well, how does the brakes work in that MiG-17? And I said, well, they're kind of air brakes. And he said, well, what happened? I didn't know. And he said, I think you need to study. I think it took me 3 briefings before he said, okay, you're good to go. But I felt, God bless him, because when I left, after briefing him and the rest of the squadron on those things, knowing that I passed their muster, I knew I could go to any squadron that didn't know 1/10 of the stuff that they knew and be able to be confident and give a good briefing.
At around this time, Henderson recalled that the Aggressors started experiencing challenges in recruiting the right type of pilot.
And the Philippines, they handpicked their people throughout their history. We handpicked ours. I didn't get involved in any of that, but the TAC handpicked theirs for the first go around. And then it was, you can't keep doing this and taking the top guys. You're killing the operational units. You're going to have to take some lesser golden boys. So they dropped the bar, paid a price, but they dropped the bar to where it was 1 fighter tour and 500 hours, I think, was the minimum to be an aggressor. And that's not much. And so we got a whole influx for several years of young kids, good pilots. They were very capable, didn't have the temperament. You know, maybe 1 in 5 had the right temperament. And so we started having problems. You know, I mean, training, we'd go out and the unit would go, I don't want to deal with you, you know. A real problem, and all because of attitude.
They were all pretty well hand selected for the original cadre and for a couple of years after that. But then they started opening up the pipeline, and we lost our by name request for our assignment there, and we were getting assigned from Personnel Center for pilots just to go in there to the Aggressors. So we got a mixed bag of guys, some of them good, some of them not so good. It's but it's sort of the standard deviation and curve in any organization.
By 1984, the Nellis Aggressors had such a bad reputation for recklessness that they faced cancellation, but that's a story for another time.